On a wet October night, the convent breathed like a sleeping animal, stone walls sweating rain, gutters coughing, the sea below the cliff roaring in its own dark throat. By dawn, four sisters were gone, leaving only made beds, folded habits, and a silence that felt like a hand pressed over a mouth. They called it Saint Aurelia, an old house of prayer set above the harbor where gulls screamed and the lighthouse blinked its slow eyelid through fog. At vespers the sisters sang low and steady, voices thin as thread in that cold nave. When the bell fell quiet, they drifted down the dim corridors like shadows that had learned to walk. Sister Magdalene, who had been a nurse before she took the veil, put a kettle on in the pantry. Sister Colette polished a brass candlestick until her face bent in the shine. Sister Ruth counted loaves for the next day's alms, lips moving as if the numbers were a prayer. The novice, Anna too young for the heaviness in her eyes, stood with the mop in the sacristy and traced the grain of the wood with her toe. It was a life like a circle, prayer, work, sleep. No one expected the circle to break. The abbess Mother Inez did her rounds by lamplight, small and sturdy as a sparrow in a gray shawl. She checked the windows, she checked the locks, she listened to the wind press its cheek to the glass. When she reached the courtyard door, she felt the handle and frowned. The old lock was brown with rust, stiff as a joint that had learned to ache, but tonight it carried thin new scratches that bit like fresh fingernails. She told herself that the sea air did strange things to metal. She told herself that worry was a form of pride. She went to bed with rain in her ears. Sometime after midnight the storm deepened. The cistern overflowed and turned the cobblestones into a mirror, rainwater standing in sheets across the square. The chapel candles, left to keep the presence of God from feeling alone, burned low. A single line of wax slipped from one altar candle and ran down the brass like a tear, then another, tiny white rivers that found the edge of the holder and fell, drop after drop, onto the sacristy floor. The water outside swallowed every footprint, every path. Inside, the house held its breath. At Lauds, Mother Inez lit the lamps and noticed the first wrong thing. The novice's bed was empty, neat as a postcard. Then Sister Colette's smoothed flat as if by careful hands not intending to return. Sister Ruth's and Sister Magdalene's the same. On each pillow lay a small metal cross, each one polished, each one cold. The habits they should have worn were folded in perfect squares at the foot of each mattress. The staircase smelled of blown-out wick. In the chapel, 5 candles guttered down to black, and one had cried itself out on the floor, leaving that white trail to the sacristy like someone had carried a candle and not noticed it was bleeding. The abbess rang the bell until the rope burned her palms. Sisters slipped from their cells, faces pale in the early light. They searched the refectory, the infirmary, the linen room, the tiny library that smelled of old paper and soap. They walked the corridors in pairs, soft shoes whispering. On the corridor wall, Anna had once drawn a circle with a stub of chalk and written a word underneath, persevere, then scrubbed it clean, but sometimes the ghost of it showed when the light was right. Today the wall looked clean. As everything looked clean. The house had been emptied so carefully it felt like a ritual. The police came with their wet coats dripping and their notebooks already damp. They were men who knew the harbor and the bars and the tides, but did not know what to do with this much quiet. Inspector Gent wiped his glasses, set them back on his nose, and looked helplessly at the beds made up to please a god who had not kept watch. The courtyard gave him nothing. The water sat there like a lie and held no prints. The old lock on the main gate was scarred where a tool had worried at it, but the gate still latched. The bolt had not been drawn. He knelt to touch the scratches and felt the burrs catch his skin. Fresh, but not yesterday fresh, not weeks fresh. Fresh like someone had stood there last night and tried and failed, then for some reason decided not to open the door after all. A young officer with a lantern followed the trail of wax across the sacristy floor. It ended at the seam where the stone met a plaster wall that led to the pantry. He knocked and heard only dull echo. He called for anyone to open the pantry door. The abbess came with the key ring that hung from her belt and made quick work of the lock. The pantry gave them sacks of flour, a ripe smell of apples, jars of preserved plums, the kettle waiting on the hob where Sister Magdalene had left it. In the low light, a patch of plaster near the baseboard looked just a shade newer than the rest, like a bruise still healing. The officer ran his fingers over it. Smooth, too smooth. Gent made a note and kept moving. The storm had flooded roads and he could not afford to get lost in one room's secrets. He didn't know yet which small puzzles mattered and which were just the house playing tricks. The whispers started before noon. A fisherman said he saw four black shapes on the cliff path after vespers, walking single file, heads bowed. A woman who ran the harbor cafe swore there had been five shapes, not four, and that the last carried a lamp that did not throw light. The sacristan from the parish church said the missing sisters must have gone on a pilgrimage to the ancient shrine across the water. Some vows call people in the night, he muttered, like the tide. Someone else hissed the word cult under his breath. And then there was the talk about the priest, Father Laurent, who came up from the town to say Mass at Saint Aurelia on Thursdays, who had a way of listening that made people think he knew more than he said. If anyone had heard what the missing had carried in their hearts, it would have been him. Inspector Gent found Father Laurent in the rectory garden, his cassock wet at the hem, hand on the head of a stone angel green with moss. The priest was not old and not young, fair where the fishermen were dark, a worried hand forever pushing his hair back from his forehead when he spoke. He offered tea. He offered the kind of answers that are almost answers but not quite. Had any of the sisters asked for counsel lately? Always, he said, but nothing out of the ordinary. Did Sister Magdalene carry burdens? She mourned the world she left as converts do. Sister Colette, she heard music in her sleep and wondered if it was the devil singing. Sister Ruth, she had a brother who drank. Anna, he paused. She had the eyes of someone who had seen too much for one so young. Gent asked about rumors. The priest's mouth tightened. People want stories, he said. They want a sin to point at. If women go missing, they want a man to blame or else a demon. It is harder to believe in a small door in an ordinary wall. He said it like a man who had seen small doors before. When the inspector pressed him, Father Laurent spread his hands. I know as much as you do, he said softly. Maybe less. The confessional is for God. My head holds only fog. The sisters told their own kinds of truth. One said she saw Sister Ruth sit long in the chapel the week before, hands cupped like she was trying to catch something falling from the air. Another said Sister Colette had taken apart the harmonium in the choir loft to oil it in the middle of the night and hummed a tune she did not know. Someone remembered that Sister Magdalene had cried over a photograph she kept hidden in her Bible, a little boy with a gap in his teeth, and then had kissed the page and put it away. The novice Anna had a way of holding her breath when anyone said the word mother, like she was a diver about to go under again. These were not clues. These were crumbs the mind drops in the forest so it can say it tried. They searched the harbor with spotlights. They sent a small boat out under the cliff to look for fresh breaks in the rock, for dresses snagged on driftwood, for anything at all. The beam slid over the water and made the rain look like silver nails. The lighthouse blinked at its slow pace as if it would not hurry for anyone's grief. No bodies rose. No scraps of cloth fluttered on the thorn bushes near the path. The sea kept its own counsel. Days passed. The abbess's hands shook when she poured tea. The sisters walked the corridors as if the dark had gained a new name. Inspector Gent slept in a chair in his office with the file open on his chest, the smell of wet wool and old paper keeping him company. Some nights he dreamed of the trail of wax and woke with his palm flat against his desk as if it were cold stone. Winter came quick on the coast. The wind found every crack and pressed its damp fingers through. The convent wrapped itself in shawls. No one said the name Anna out loud for a month, as if the syllables were a curse that could carry her farther away. Father Laurent preached on the book of Jonah and spoke about being swallowed. People listened too closely. Someone painted an eye on the convent gate one night, a terrible blue eye that watched the road. Mother Inez had it scrubbed off at dawn and then sat down hard on the first step and wept. Time tried to do its trick and turn living pain into a story you could hold. The file thickened with notes and thin as onion skin with reports. New inspectors came and went. Inspector Gent retired with bad knees and a damp cough and gave the case to a young woman who laughed too easily and kept a pencil behind her ear like a schoolgirl. She took pictures of the courtyard when it was dry and the stones showed their scars, hairline cracks like veins. She tapped the pantry wall and said, "It sounds wrong here," and the mason who stood with her shrugged and said, "Old houses always sound like secrets." She put a yellow sticky note over the photograph of the wall. Check again. 40 years of sticky notes can make a wall of their own. Most of them fall. A few stay and become part of the paint. Father Laurent was transferred to a parish inland. People said it was nothing, just the bishop moving pieces on his board, but some whispered that it was because he had listened too well, because he had heard something and told it to the wrong ear, because you cannot know this much and stay where everyone can see you. He died in a car on a dark road the winter after the transfer. They said he fell asleep at the wheel. They said his pockets were filled with letters no one else had read and a rosary with a broken crucifix. The Christ snapped at the ankles. It was a death like any other. It was a death people made into a story when they had nothing else. The convent changed hands. The diocese closed it and opened it again as a house for retreats. Then money dried up and the roof went bad and they boarded the windows. The only light was the lighthouse down the hill, slow and faithful, and the moon when it cared to come. Moss climbed the stone. Cats took the cloister for a warm place to sleep. The wind kept prowling the corridors, learning them by heart. And then, 40 years after that October night, a plumber named Luca came with his toolbox and his easy grin to fix a leak that had turned the pantry ceiling the color of old tea. He was not a man who believed in miracles. He believed in pipes and pressure and the way old buildings like to fight you then give up all at once. He believed in the sound of a hammer as it met a lie. He stood in the pantry with his lamp and stared at the swollen plaster where the ceiling had bowed, at the way the baseboard paint didn't match the wall, at the hairline crack wandering down to the floor like a river that had lost its map. He knocked. He listened. The sound that came back to him wasn't the right sound. It was too full, too quiet. He pried up the baseboard and found a seam he did not expect. He put the hammer claw into it and felt it bite. He pulled and heard a sigh like old breath. A strip of plaster came away and a smell rolled out that made him step back and press the crook of his arm over his face. It wasn't rot, it wasn't mold. It was something dry and sweet and sad. It was the smell of rooms with no air. He widened the hole carefully, a careful man now, sweat stinging his eyes though the room was cold. Behind the plaster lay wood stained the color of tea, and behind the wood lay a dark that wasn't the kind you can light with a lamp. The first thing his light found was a string of beads, brown and smooth, lying on a small shelf right inside as if waiting to be picked up. The crucifix had a chip at the edge, and on the back, scratched with the tip of a pin, were letters, a rosary left like a name. He set it gently on the pantry floor, then reached around and found another set of beads tangled with the first, this crucifix missing Christ entirely, only the cross left, plain as a plank. The knot at the end was tied in a way his grandmother had used when she taught him numbers, a loop made for counting. He found a third and a fourth, 4 rosaries. He thought of 4 hands, 4 sets of fingers that had worn them smooth over and over until prayer was as much a motion as a word. He widened the opening. A thin line of wax had run down the inside of the wooden frame and dried there 40 years ago, still pink at the edges like a tear caught mid-fall. His light rested on it. He swallowed. He told himself to keep going. He told himself that people wanted rooms that didn't hold water and he was just doing his job and he had never wanted to be the first to know anything. Inside, the space was not big. It was a tooth hacked into the jaw of the house, a closet made of stone and wood, the inside walls lined with something that looked like felt, darkened by time. On a low shelf sat a metal cup with a chip on the rim, and when he lifted it carefully and turned it in his hands, he saw a scratch on the side that made his skin crawl. Then a little cross, as if some long-ago person had tried to say, "This is mine," or "I am here." A small wooden cross lay beside the cup, the kind given to a novice when she takes her first vows. The simple cord that had once hung it at a throat lay coiled like a sleeping snake. Luca crouched lower, his knees popping. He shone the light along the base, past a scatter of buttons and an old hairpin to where the floor met the wall. There a little square of cloth had been wedged into a crack, the corner of a folded thing. He teased it free with 2 fingers, slow as if pulling something from a wound. It was a scapular, wool darkened to near black with old oils and time, its ribbons stiff. On the inside, in thread too pale and clumsy to be a seamstress's, a name had been stitched, Anna. The letters were crooked and brave. He felt his throat go tight in a way he did not understand. He set it next to the rosaries and the cup as if laying out relics. He could have stopped then, he didn't. He pushed his light deeper and found the outline of something else at the back, something that was wood but also more than wood. It was a hatch. His light found the hinges, not the kind a carpenter shows you, but the kind he hides under trim. He ran his hand along the seam and felt splinters lift into his skin. He tested it gentle. It lifted a little and then stuck, held by something, an old nail or a prayer. He thought of fawning his boss. He thought of calling no one at all. He thought of his grandmother's kitchen and the way a picture of the Sacred Heart had hung there, the eye looking right at you while you stole sugar with your fingers. He lifted again. The hatch gave a shudder and a sigh, as if it had waited a long time to be asked. He did not open it then, not all the way. He was not a brave man, only a stubborn one, and something in him wanted a witness. He backed into the hall, breath loud in his own ears, and looked for his phone with unsteady hands. His call to the owner came out as a jumble. "You should come," he said. "Bring the parish or the police or the abbess herself if she still walks the earth. There's a place here." Theirs. He stopped because words felt like two small nails to hold what he had found. When the current abbess came, older than stone and kinder than most mornings, and the young inspector who had inherited the file after the last inspector had retired, the pantry seemed like any pantry in any house. Flour, apples, the drafts that think they know secrets. Luca showed them the whole, the rosaries lined up on the floor like sleeping snakes, the cup, the scapular. The abbess took the one with Anna's name between her fingers, and her eyes closed for a moment as if she could feel a pulse in the wool. They took pictures, they called the diocese. They called the police chief who whispered "Saints preserve us" before he remembered he did not believe. They cut the hole larger, not with a crash but with careful hands, each flake of plaster taken like a confession. It was the inspector who lifted the little hatch at last, her fingers steady, her breath coming quiet in her chest. The air that rose to meet them was old and thin and tasted of iron. It was the kind of air that makes you want to apologize. Her lamp showed them the truth first in small things. The heel of a shoe, the corner of a book with swollen pages, a braid of hair tied with a blue ribbon that had faded to something like ash. It showed them lines scratched into the wall at the height of a kneeling person, hash marks made in clumsy rows, dozens upon dozens, as if someone had tried to count time without doors to mark it. It showed them a tiny cross burned into the wood with the tip of a heated nail, the edges charred, the center rubbed smooth by a thumb. It showed them in a shallow niche near the floor a small tin that had once held cough drops, now holding what looked like folded notes. They did not open the tin then. They did not need to. The room itself was a letter. The abbess put her hand on the inspector's arm. Her voice, when it came, sounded like the sea sounds when it is finally tired. "They were here," she said. "All this time they never left." She did not say the rest, that the house had swallowed them, that the walls had kept them, that people had walked past this pantry for 40 years with flour on their hands and never guessed. She did not need to. The truth had a taste. Everyone in the room could feel it on their tongues. News moves faster than grief, even in a small town with bad weather. By evening, the harbor lights blinked over faces turned toward the convent, guessing, measuring. The cafe poured coffee like ritual wine. Old men who had never stepped inside the chapel since they were boys spoke softly about Anna, about Ruth, about Colette, about Magdalene, saying their names as if now at last it was allowed. Someone brought flowers and set them at the gate even before the police tape went up. A woman traced a cross on the stone with her thumb and left a smudge. It could have been wax. It could have been dirt. It looked for a moment like a tear. The inspector stayed late, her pencil dull and her heart too loud. She touched the trail of old wax with a gloved finger and felt it give, fragile and stubborn both. She stood in the sacristy and listened to the empty room. She walked the flooded courtyard in her mind and knew why it had kept no prints. She stood in the pantry with her lamp and breathed air that had waited for 4 decades to be let out and tried to count the marks on the wall but stopped when the numbers began to swim. She thought of Father Laurent and the small doors he had not named. She thought of the young novice's crooked stitches. She thought of 4 beds made up with care by hands that had set the world in order one last time. When she stepped outside, the night met her with cold that felt clean. The sea was quieter now, but it still kept its long story under its own tongue. The lighthouse blinked, patient as ever, a slow heartbeat on the edge of the dark. Rain hung in the air like breath. Somewhere a cat threaded its way through grass. The abbess lingered by the gate and looked up at the stone house that had held both prayer and hunger, both mercy and whatever you would call the opposite. I will light the candles, she said, almost to herself. For them and for us, and for anyone who didn't know what it meant to keep watch. Inside, the wick caught and opened like a small eye, one flame and then another. Light took the corners back from the shadows inch by inch. In those soft edges, it was easy to imagine the sisters as they had been that last evening, Magdalene with the kettle, Colette humming to the harmonium, Ruth counting, Anna with the mop and her bright, brave stitching. It was easy to imagine them step from the dark of that hidden room and take their places again. Press the habit smooth, tie the scapular ribbon, find the bead that always stuck between finger and thumb and begin to pray. The inspector closed her notebook and listened to the low song of the lamp. She knew there would be more to come, bones perhaps, or letters or things that made the throat burn. She knew there would be people quick to claim certainty about what had happened and why. But tonight there was this. A room opened, air released, proof laid in simple objects that seemed to carry their own quiet heat. 4 rosaries, a cup, a novice cross, a square of wool with a girl's name stitched into it, and a patch of dried wax like a trail that had waited 40 years to show someone where to look. She stood very still and let the moment rest on her like a hand. Outside, the sea turned, then turned again. The candle flame trembled, then steadied. In that trembling, in that steadiness, something like an answer lived and something like a question, and both of them felt true. Rain blew sideways across the harbor as if the night were trying to erase itself, and in that blur of water and light, the old convent rose like a memory that had learned to keep secrets. He came back with a microphone and a map, and the first thing he noticed was the sound under the wind, like a bell heard through a wall. They told him the case had cooled into folklore, the file yellowed and brittle, its pages a nest of rumors and half-answers. They said Saint Aurelia was a place people pointed at when they ran out of words, when they wanted silence to mean more than it did. But he was not here for the legend. He was here for the weight of it, the way the stones sweated in a storm, the way floorboards groaned when you walked across old grief. He stood at the gate with the sea at his back and the house above him, and he pressed the button on his recorder. His voice in the headphones sounded calm. It did not match the fast beat under his ribs. The streetlights on the climb-up flickered as if tired of their work. One stuttered so hard it looked like a heartbeat on a failing monitor. The path itself was slick, a dark ribbon threaded through the grass. His camera caught the weeds slicked to the stones, the paint flacking off the iron of the gate, the way the padlock held its own damp shine. He put his hand on the cold metal and felt a shiver that began at his palm and went up his arm. The map in his pocket, folded and refolded, showed the convent as boxes and lines. The boxes did not tell what the air tasted like. The lines did not tell how narrow the hallways felt when the wind rose. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and oil and a stubborn soap that never fully left the tile. The new abbess met him in the entry, small and steady, hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweater as if hiding a tremor. She had been kind over the phone. In that way some people are kind when they are already tired. "We will show you what we can," she said, and her eyes moved past him to the door as if counting the seconds until it shut again. He signed the visitor log with the pen you had to coax to life by scribbling circles. His name looked thinner than he liked. He wrote the date twice by mistake. He pressed the recorder and said the date out loud to fix it to the air. They led him first to the archives, if you could call a locked room down a side hall an archive. The door had 2 bolts and a keyhole polished by worry. The abbess held up a wallet of keys, found the right one by touch, and turned it with the care of a person who has opened the same thing 100 times and never once wanted to. The room was long and narrow, shelves to the ceiling, boxes labeled in a dozen hands. The camera watched him run his fingers along the spines. Ledger books, blue notebooks, binders that had warped in damp years. He pulled a file marked Saint Aurelia, missing persons 1980-1990. The folder spined open like a bird with its wings pinned. Half the original reports were there, onion skin paper that made a dry music when you turned it. Photographs had bled into their plastic envelopes and left ghosts. There were notes in 3 inks, none of them steady. "Some pages are missing," he said. He knew they would be, he said it anyway. "They went to the diocese," the abbess said. or to the police, or to someone who said they had a right. This was before my time. She held the edge of the shelf with one hand as if to steady the room. We copy what we can. He found the copy of the ledger from the year the sisters disappeared. Columns of neat numbers, deliveries of flour, of wine, of candles, repairs to the roof, a bill for little printed cards with prayers on them, and then a run of entries for lumber and hardware. He ran his finger along them: oak beams, plywood, hardware unspecified, quantities that made no sense for a house that had not added a room in 50 years, dates that sat like stones where a stream should run. One invoice was marked for a Sunday when the supply yard wasn't open. Another had a signature that looked like no one's name, only a squashed river of ink. He drew small check marks in his notebook, a quiet row of questions. You could smell oil when you opened the drawer with the keys. The ring was heavy, dark, with the skin of hands that had used it and maybe prayed while they did. Each key had a tag, some with words smeared away. Refectory, laundry, choir loft, organ, bell rope room. He lifted the tag that read ARCHIVES and laid the key down on a sheet of paper and traced it. It left a thin shine on the white, an echo of itself. The camera looked down the whole time, breathing in the slow zoom of attention, the way even ordinary metal seems to wake under the glass eye. He went to see the retired detective next. The man lived in a small house with a roof that held the last light of day like a cupped hand. The detective's name was Ghent, and he moved like the weather had moved through him. A kettle hissed on the stove. The clock over the sink ticked loud. When the recorder clicked, Ghent looked at it as if it might ask him a question he could not bear to answer. "I still hear that bell at night," he said after a while, not looking at the camera, not looking at the window, not looking at anything at all. Not the bell itself. The rope. The sound it makes when you pull it and the fibers stretch against each other. The sound a house makes when it is trying not to wake. The journalist kept his voice low. He asked about the trail of wax, the scratched lock, the pantry wall that sounded wrong when you knocked. "I was a young idiot," Ghent said, not unkindly. "I thought the sea would tell me something if I stared at it hard enough. I thought grief made people say things that weren't true. I only believed what I could hold in my hands. Turns out the house was offering me things I could hold. I just didn't take them." He got up and went to the back room and came back with a cardboard box the color of old teeth. He set it on the table and pushed it across. "Kept these when no one was looking. I didn't know if that was right. I still don't." Inside the box were paper napkins with notes on them, their edges stained by coffee rings. There was a torn map of the convent's lower rooms with arrows, drawn by a hand that could not decide where to point. There was a sketch of the choir loft with measurements in pencil and 3 question marks. There was a receipt for oak plank and joist hangers with a note, WHOSE, in Ghent's tilted print. There were 2 small photographs, gray with age. A stack of crates in the cloister walk and a truck you could only see a corner of, its plate unreadable, taken in the wet dark by someone's shaky hand. "They came at night," Ghent said, inhaling through his teeth. "A groundskeeper called me later, said he didn't like the sound, wood against wood where there shouldn't be. He said the driver wore a hat so low you couldn't see his face. I went up in the morning. The sisters said it was nothing, renovations, always that word. It wasn't a lie exactly, it just wasn't the whole truth." He took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The skin there was worn. "You ever open a door and feel the cold like a hand on your chest?" he asked. "Like the air on the other side has been sitting so long it learned not to move. That's what the pantry felt like. I wrote it down, air like a tomb. I kept writing it until the words stopped meaning anything." The groundskeeper was harder to find. He lived now on the edge of town in a small upstairs flat that smelled like boiled potatoes and sea salt. His hands were thick with work. He wiped them with a cloth before he shook the journalist's hand as if he could take the stain away and be proper for a minute. When the question came, "What do you remember about the crates?" his eyes went to the corner of the room where the wallpaper had peeled. He stared there long enough the recorder caught the sound of him blinking. "They arrived after Compline," he said finally. "That was the trick of it. Men like to move in a way that makes you want to look away. No one looks at the back door when the bell is done. They look at their feet. They ask God to forgive them for not praying better. They go to bed." He made a small sound in his throat that could have been a laugh if anything were funny. "I opened the gate. It wasn't my place to ask why. A signature here, a signature there. The paper said lumber for repairs. The wagon had more than lumber. I could hear metal. You can always hear metal in the way it knocks. And there was a humming one night coming from the choir loft, not loud, just enough to make your teeth feel odd. Wind carries sound in this town like a woman carries news. It brings it close and then it takes it away again. He put his hand flat on the table. His nails had crescents of oil beneath them. A priest told me once to speak to walls, not men. Walls won't repeat you, he said. I've been doing that ever since. There was a former sister who first said no, then maybe, then yes. She met him in a cafe in town where the sugar packets had prayers on the back in tiny type. She wore a blue cardigan with a snag on the sleeve and a face that tried hard to be blank. When he asked about renovations, her eyes flicked to the door and then to the window and then somewhere that seemed to be inside her own skull. She broke eye contact like it was a habit. We painted the choir loft one summer, she said, stirring a tea she did not drink. They said the wood needed sealing. We sealed it until the smell of varnish was a Bible verse. My head rang for a week. I can still smell it when I'm tired. She put the spoon down. Her fingers were long, the nails short, the half moons at their base pale as milk. They told us the floor needed to be stronger. We brought up joists. We brought up planks. We slid them in under the boards as if we were tucking a child back into bed. We were told to pray against drafts. We were told we would not like the winter wind if we left it to itself. She looked up at last. A man said the words air exchange like they were part of a litany. I did not know what they meant. I do now. He asked her if there had been plans. Drawings, she said, hand-drawn, blue pencil lines on thin paper, arrows that didn't point where you thought they should. Some went into the wall and stopped. Some went under the floor and stopped. A note written at the bottom said persevere. She breathed out the word as if it still held heat. When I first came, I thought it meant prayer. Later, I understood it could mean something else. He went back to the convent with his camera and his map and a copy of the lumber receipts. He set the pages on the choir loft rail and took pictures of pictures. The wood under his palms felt too new in a place this old. He pressed his ear to the floor and held his breath. For a moment, all he heard was his own blood. Then, as if the building were clearing its throat, there was a faint metallic sound, a hum that wasn't a hum so much as the idea of one riding the wind in thin strands. He walked the length of the loft and found where the sound grew a fraction, a hair thinner or thicker. He tapped the boards with his knuckles. Creak, creak. One spot answered in a different voice, a tone that had learned secret words. He knelt and put his cheek to the wood. The cold there felt like a letter slipped under a door. He filmed the organ keys up close, the oil ground into their corners by hands that had gone and never asked where the music ended up. He filmed the dust in the stop knobs in the way dust gathers when no one is allowed to move it. He filmed the latch on the little door under the loft stairs, iron worn smooth by the same motion made by many hands. He slid the latch and put his hand on the door and waited to see if his own heart would settle. It did not. The archives in the town hall shut at 5. He got there at 4:52 with wet hair and a sense that if the door closed on his face, the night would take something he needed back. The clerk looked at the clock, then at him, then at the recorder and made a face that said, "You will make me late for soup." 10 minutes, she said, and handed him a sign-in sheet as if it were a dare. He wrote his name twice again without meaning to and underlined the date. He asked for building permits from 1979 to 1981 and for contractor lists, for any letters about renovations at Saint Aurelia. He said the word renovations with care. The binder she brought him was older than both of them together. He flipped. The pages cracked. There were entries for roof patches, for gutter work, for repainting. There were no entries for new walls. There were no entries for soundproofing or hidden vents or steel fittings. There was a small note written in the margin of a page for 1980 in an unfamiliar hand, see diocese. The arrow next to the note pointed off the page into beige air. He took a picture of the arrow just because he didn't like being told to look elsewhere. He looked anyway. The diocese office smelled like lemon cleaner and new carpet and the kind of paper you buy in bulk. A woman at the desk told him to wait. A man in a clerical collar told him with a smile that had learned to smile through anything that files were sealed for now. He asked to see receipts. He asked to see the old blueprints. He asked to see anything that had the word choir on it. The man's smile did not change shape. "We will be in touch," he said. and the words fell to the floor like coins that were not worth anything anymore. At night, the convent changed. The hallways filled with a darker kind of dark. The clocks in the rooms seemed louder. The microphone caught sounds you did not hear with your ears and put them back for you. A sigh where there was no person, the soft hiss of the sea when everything else was still, the small tick of wood settling in cold. He walked the length of the nave with the camera following, slow as if the floor could crack under a hurry. The choir loft rose above like a balcony where someone had once leaned long enough to leave part of themselves in the railing. He stood under it and looked up at the boards he had pressed his ear to earlier, and he said into the recorder, "I can hear it when the wind changes." And the words felt like a thread he held between his thumb and first finger, pulled taut toward the stairs. The abbess met him there. She held two keys in her palm like a quiet offering. "One is mine," she said. "The other was Sister Miriam's. She sent it to us last year without a note. We never knew what it opened." The metal was warm from her hand. The tags were smudged, one with a single letter. See, he looked at the latch again. It had scratch marks on the face, tiny lines where someone had pushed and pushed and pushed as if, long ago, it had opened more easily and then, at some point, had decided to learn to resist. He did not open it then. He turned away and went back to the refectory and ate with the sisters. He filmed hands breaking bread, the steam rising from bowls, the way one woman's shoulder touched the other when they turned at the same time, a choreography of habit. He filmed the broom leaning against the wall with wear spots that showed where the person who used it liked to rest her hand. He filmed the bell rope in its little room, the braid frayed in one place where it had caught too hard on someone's grip. He filmed to give himself a reason to wait. When he went back to the choir loft with the abbess and the groundskeeper, who had said he wouldn't come and then had shown up anyway, his hands felt steadier. The camera watched his hands more than his face, as if they were the part of him that knew they were making a mark on the night. The abbess held her breath when he put the first key in. It turned and did nothing. He set it aside. He slid the second key in, and this time, somewhere in the wood, something old gave up a fight. The sound was small and huge. As he lifted the latch, the door stuck. The groundskeeper put his shoulder to it. His breath came hard. The wood moved with a sound that felt like hunger. The space beyond was narrower than a hallway and deeper than a closet, and the air that came out had a taste of iron. He held the lamp high. The light shook and then held. Inside, he found what the receipts had hinted at and the stories had circled. A duct ran along the inside wall, thin metal with dust that had hung there for days and days and days, some of it disturbed by something that wasn't human, not rats, the soft signature of air. There was a small fan mounted in a frame, the blade a silver circle that looked like a coin in a museum case. Wires ran off into a wall and disappeared. Above, a panel cut neatly into the ceiling led somewhere beyond this box, somewhere into the belly of the building. Someone had written numbers on it in red pencil. The numbers had sweated until they blurred. There were handprints on the beam near the door, 4 of them at the height of someone short. The prints were darker than the wood, greased by time. He put his hand next to them without touching and felt the prick of the hair on his arm rise. The hum was there, stronger now that they were inside. It wasn't the fan, it did not turn. It was something wind did when it found a hole and tried it on, a note held in a throat not made for singing. He set the lamp down and the shadows made ladders across the metal and the floor and the walls. The camera sat on a crate and watched without moving. The abbess reached out and touched the duct with one finger. "Cold," she said softly. As if she were telling a child she had checked for monsters under the bed and felt only their absence. They found hand-drawn plans rolled and tied with twine behind the panel, the paper browned at the edges. He untied the twine like a man opening a letter from a person he had known in another life. The lines were clean, the arrows careful. Some pointed to vents marked with little crosses. Some pointed into walls with notes that said simply, "Keep." Some stopped and began again in the same place, as if the person drawing could not decide how honest to be. In the corner, in small, careful letters, was one word, persevere. He thought of the chalk on the hallway wall, the way that word had been scrubbed and scrubbed until only the idea of it remained. He thought of a novice's hand stitching her name in wool. Beneath the plans were receipts clipped together with a rusted pin. They matched the ones from the archive in number and date. They did not match what anyone had agreed to build. A note was scrawled along the edge in a hand that tried to be fast and ended up being wild. Choir loft reinforce, do not log. He ran his thumb over the words and felt the dent where the pen had pressed too hard. He asked the groundskeeper what the humming had been all those years ago. A fan, the man said, or a promise of one. He looked at the metal, his jaw tight, or a way to keep breath where breath should not be. They stayed there a long time, not speaking, because words felt too large in a space that had held so much of the opposite. Once the wind shifted and the hum dropped out and came back again in a new key. The microphone captured it and made a thin line on the recorder's screen. He watched the line and thought it looked like a road, narrow and clear, running toward a single sealed door. Well, he asked the abbess if she had known. Not like this, she said, but the house knows before we do. It holds the shape of things. You can feel where a lie sits if you put your hands on the wall and close your eyes. She leaned her head against the wood, her breath fogged a little in the cold. We closed doors for years and called it prudence. Prudence can make a room of its own. He filmed the hinges up close, the way they had bit deep into wood not meant to carry them. He filmed the screws that were not from this place or time. He filmed the small dent on the door frame at the exact height of a hand that would have tapped there night after night, a quiet rhythm to say, I am here. He did not ask whose hand. Some questions do not care for answers. Outside, the storm had cleaned itself away and left the sky raw and open. The lighthouse blinked, a slow, even blink, the eye of a giant that refuses to fall asleep even when the night asks it to. He and the abbess and the groundskeeper stood by the open door a moment before they shut it again and latched it, as if you could ever close something like this once it was opened. He wrote the time down in his notebook. He wrote the temperature, though he did not need to. He wrote the word humming and underlined it twice. He went back to town with a bag of copies and a camera full of rooms. He watched the video in the small hours with the volume low, the way you watch a person breathing in sleep, checking for rise and fall. The floorboards sounded like old bones. The keys shone with oil. The hand-drawn plans lay on the table with arrows that pointed into blank space as if blank space could be a destination. Each small lie had a date, and each misdated invoice made the corridor narrower, tighter, less kind. You could feel how little room was left to turn around. In the morning he sat with Detective Gent again. He played him the sound. The old man closed his eyes. He smiled in a way that hurt to see. That's it, he said. That's the bell, only smaller. That's the sound of a thing that knows it should be quiet and can't be. He put his hand flat on the table as if to steady the room. You think truth comes like a shout, he said. It doesn't. It comes like this, a wire singing in the wind, a draft across your cheek, a note held too long. That afternoon, under a sky the color of metal, they went back to the convent with the permits that didn't exist and the plans that did and the receipts that lied and the keys that didn't. They walked the corridor to the choir loft door as if the floor had been made for this one walk. The camera breathed. The microphone drank in the small sounds. The abbess did not speak. The groundskeeper turned his hat in his hands. The journalist put his palm to the wood and felt it answer. He lifted the latch and the door opened without sticking this time, as if the building had decided it was time to stop resisting. They did not find bones or bodies or a confession written on the wall. What they found was smaller and worse. A path for air to move where air should not move, a way to carry voices or breath or both, a structure meant to hold more weight than music, a room for sound to go to sleep in and wake in again. They found proof that someone had planned it and the plan had held. The sealed door they had moved through was not the last in the house. There would be more. There always are, in places that learn to keep their own counsel. When they stepped back out onto the loft, the nave below them looked like a mouth open in a long, slow word. Light pushed in through the high windows and made bars on the floor. He took a breath and held it, then let it go very slowly as if it belonged to the place as much as to him. The abbess put a hand on the rail and looked down. I used to think silence was holy, she said, quiet, almost laughing. I still do, but I've learned there is a kind that bruises. He clicked the recorder off and the room felt larger right away, as if a small machine had been taking part of it and had given it back. They closed the door again and stood together a moment in the dim wood and metal and skin and salt and time. The sea spoke its one word over and over. The lighthouse blinked. Somewhere in the building, a clock took a breath and decided to keep going. And in that soft pause, in that thin hum that was wind and memory and machine all at once, the truth sat with them. A quiet thing that wanted to be heard, a corridor tight as a throat, a door that had learned to open in its own time. When he finally stepped away, his hand left the faintest print on the dust, and he did not brush it out. He wanted the room to remember he had come, and he wanted very much to remember the way the air had felt when it touched his face and didn't lie.